It all began with a note on gray parchment, where the ink was uneven, as if the scribe's hand had been shaking. In the margins was a familiar symbol, a small cross and a bird, drawn by only one person in the area, a former student of the monastery school. The note lay on the threshold of the weaver's house in the evening, when the copper drums of the fair were blaring in the city, and people were drawn to the fires where meat was roasted, and people argued about other people's misfortunes. The note said that tomorrow the Lord would have the wedding of his vassal, and that the old people would again whisper about the rite of the first night. At the bottom it said, "Please do not rush to conclusions, because the evidence is still coming, and please keep the second sheet that will come with the messenger." Thus began a story that at first resembled a melodrama about family quarrels and grievances, but by the middle it would become a straight road into a troubled night, and by the end it would bring clarity and the right to stand tall. I welcome everyone who is listening to this story and ask you to write in the comments where you are watching from. It is important for me to know where your eyes and hearts are right now. I hope you enjoy listening. That evening, a weaver named Ignatius was not thinking about letters. He was sewing a new belt for his daughter. The belt was simple, but neatly woven, with a narrow red edge. His daughter, Marina, was engaged to a blacksmith's apprentice who wielded a hammer with confidence, although his shoulders still had a lot of adolescent bulk. Ignatius took care of the dowry, not showing it to his neighbors unnecessarily, lest they jinx it. His wife, Borislava, was drying herbs for mash on a rope, and soup was cooling on the table. Everything was normal. But next to the dowry bundle lay that gray sheet of paper with the bird symbol on it. The bird had once been drawn by a boy from the monastery courtyard. He ran around the courtyards, copied records for merchants, and explained letters to townspeople who could not read. His name was Galbert. He was considered a nobody because he was a foster child taken in by monks from the road. He was respected for his neat handwriting, but he was not allowed to enter the threshold of a noble house. Galbert remembered everything he heard at the shops, and once said that in an old book he had seen a word that everyone called the terrible rite of the master on the first wedding night, but in reality it was not so. No one listened to him. They called him a bore and sent him away. While Ignatius was reading the note, hooves clattered at the gate. A messenger had arrived from the castle. He said that tomorrow, on the day of the miller's son's wedding, the Lord wanted to see all the heads of families. He said there would be an announcement about old customs. He also said that tribute must be brought, as is customary for a marriage, and that the list contained a word that had caused whispering in the town. He said he had been ordered to convey this message. The town was abuzz with gossip. The women at the well said that the Lord was again plotting a shameful custom. The boys in the square whispered that they had seen the clerk from the castle carrying a thick book with a red strap to the office. In the tavern, old Clopas was enjoying his beer and said that his grandfather had told him about the droit du seigneur, but his grandfather himself was confused about the dates and places. The old man said that there was always someone around the Lord who knew how to turn a rumor into a horror story, and the tax collectors were especially good at it. Galbert sat by the monastery and cleaned his knife with feathers. He looked at the castle tower not with respect, but as a challenge. Next to him, on a stone, lay a wooden box tied with a leather strap. The strap bore the same bird symbol. He waited for the messenger to return by the same route to deliver the second letter. The next day, the chapel smelled of beeswax. The servant read prayers. The bride and groom stood uncertainly, like all young people, when their hands reach for each other, and their heads are filled with advice from home. The master sat in a chair, leaning on his elbow, and seemed indifferent. His people stood nearby. Among them was a strange-looking clerk. He had recently arrived from a distant city, was called Pontius, and as they said, knew many Latin words. He walked as if his mouth were held together by a thin thread and did not like to smile. After the service, the gentleman rose, and Pontius nodded to the servant to bring the book with the red strap. The gentleman announced that the statutes of his house would be read aloud. He said that on the day of the wedding, it was customary to pay for the loss of a worker in the family, because she was leaving for another house. He said that this was an old custom, known as a monetary gift for marriage. He said that this was the will of his ancestors, recorded in the book. Pontius recited memorized phrases about the need to honor the law. The crowd began to murmur. Opinions were divided. Some heard about the payment for the daughter's release. Others heard only about customs, and they latched onto an old frightening word that no one really understood. Someone said that the gentleman had glossed over the most important part, because in practice it was always worse. Someone said that there was surely a line in this book about the rite of the first night, and that it was no coincidence that the scribe had kept his fingers there. At that moment, a woman in a dark cloak entered the chapel. She did not remove her hood. She placed a box with a leather strap and a bird symbol on the stone floor. She said calmly that this box contained something that prevented the custom from being called a disgrace. She said that it contained letters and copies of charters from the monastery archives, written by the hand of a famous scribe. She said that the gentleman would be in trouble if he burned them. Her voice was not loud, but the crowd's mood changed. This was the first unexpected benefactor, an outsider with resources, ready to intervene. Later, it would become clear that she was the widow of a merchant who had enough money to bribe the old scriptorium guard and obtain copies. She was considered an outsider because she had arrived recently and spoke with a soft accent. She did not do this for fame, but because her daughter had already been married in another city, and there the marriage tax had been accepted without scandal, but rumors of disgrace had caught up with them and ruined their lives. She came not to fix her house, but to fix the word. While the gentleman and Pontius were whispering, the crowd noticed Galbert. He had a thin ruler in his sleeve, a remnant from school. He did not look up. He looked at the letters on the spine of the castle book. He noticed that a piece of the leather corner was missing. Such a brittle edge is common in bindings that have been opened many times in the same place. He dreamed of touching the page to understand where the scribe's habit lay. He did not hope that they would let him in. But suddenly, Pontius asked for the name of the person who had put the bird-mark on the box. The widow replied that it was the hand of one of the best local copyists. Pontius smiled and said that the local copyists were poor. The crowd took this as an insult, and someone pushed Galbert forward. So the man from below found himself in the center. It was a reversal of hidden talent against status. He took the first sheet from the box and began to read aloud calmly. He said that it referred to a marriage payment, which was paid not to the Lord for access to the body, but to the Lord's house for the loss of a worker on the farm and for the right to form a new household. He used a word similar to merchet, but without the crude connotation. He explained that in Latin it meant a monetary ransom for freeing a daughter from domain labor, and that there was no hint of bedding. He said that the payments were listed with the precision of recording sacks of grain, not human bodies. The crowd listened and digested. The gentleman frowned. Pontius asked him for a sign. The gentleman nodded. Pontius announced that the letters from the box were invalid because they were copies. He said that a copy was an unreliable thing. He said that the true word was only in the book with the red strap. He said that the local scribe was a boy without a family. At the castle gates stood a man whom no one noticed because he was always silent. It was the stableman Yezh, so called because of his shaggy hair. He was underestimated. He was considered empty-headed because he rarely looked people in the eye. At the key moment, he would turn out to be the one who knew where the book had a secret page and where the master had an old fear. But for now, he remained silent, and held the reins of the master's horse. At that moment, 2 old men with long beards entered the chapel from the courtyard. They brought a wooden box and placed it next to the widow's box. They said they had found it in the barn while rearranging the oak vats. In the box lay a piece of old binding with the master's housemark. On it was the name of his great-grandfather, several numbers of the amount, and a note that on the day of the miller's daughter's wedding, confirmation was issued that the house was exempt from grain-drying work for 2 moons because the young woman was moving to a new home. Here, there was a hint of a hidden kinship. The miller's name in the record coincided with the name of the man whom the Lord kept at a distance, calling him a half-breed. The crowd gasped, but so far, no one had allowed these conjectures to become accusations. The widow asked Halbert to compare the handwriting. He took out a ruler and showed that the slant and shape of the letters were the same on different sheets. He found a small mark where the scribe had probably been guiding the pen and stumbled on the letter. He said it was not a forgery, but a habit of a particular hand. He said that in their region, such trifles reveal the truth, because grand words cannot be relied upon. Pontius tried to close the book, but it was too late. The crowd stood in tense silence, as if standing on the edge of a pit and waiting for something else to stir below. And indeed, something stirred. The chapel door opened, and a messenger from a distant monastery appeared in the doorway. He brought the 3rd sheet. It was a copy of the royal charter. It stated that the royal court was abolishing the abuses of rural elders who demanded payment in meat and poultry for conducting wedding nights in their homes. There was no mention of the Lord's right to the bride's body. It only mentioned illegal levies. But over many years, it had taken on a different meaning in the mouths of angry people. Halbert read it aloud and said that it was precisely such passages that often became the seeds of myth. He said that in our memory and everyday life, a crumb turns into bread if it is repeated. The gentleman realized that it would be impossible to keep the situation within the bounds of a simple ceremony. He announced loudly that he was taking a day to think it over. He asked everyone to leave, but no one left. Their faces were wary. A little later, it will become clear what led to the shift in genre. In the evening, a small wooden box with no markings, simply tied with string, arrived at Ignatius's house. There was a greasy fingerprint on the box, as if it had been held by a hand smeared with oil. Ignatius thought it was a gift and wanted to put it off until tomorrow, but his wife insisted that they open it. They untied the knot and found a short-bladed knife and an unsigned note inside. The note said that if anyone made a noise in the chapel tomorrow, Marin would be taken through the garden to the hunting lodge. The note ended with the phrase, "It has always been this way and will be again." It was a twist in an everyday thriller. An ordinary box had become a threat. Ignatius turned pale. He went to the monastery to show everything to Galbert. On the way, he noticed wheel tracks on the damp ground. The cart had traveled at night, and the wheels had sunk slightly. The rims were covered with dried clay, which was taken from the river for convenience. Such clay was usually carried by the groom. Ignatius remembered this. The hedgehog really did carry barrels to the hunting lodge in the forest. But he did it not for his master, but for himself. He had long been collecting tools and old documents that he found in the castle rubbish in that guardhouse. He kept quiet, but he collected them. The night passed without sleep. In the morning, people gathered again at the chapel, but they were met not only by the priest and the master. People with clubs stood at the gate. They seemed confused because they did not know whether they would become guards or thugs. The merchant's widow came out onto the porch. She was holding the very box with the copies. She said she was ready to give it to the castle archives on condition that the Lord publicly confirm that the right of the first knight had no force in his house and would not have any. She said that if he did not do so, The copies would go to distant cities. She said she knew how to hire messengers. At that moment, something happened that turned an ordinary dispute into a tense episode. The gate swung open briefly, and a horseman in a black cloak squeezed through the opening. He shouted that a bundle of women's braids and a scrap of red cloth had been found on the road to the hunting lodge. He said that the lodge looked strange. The crowd began to murmur. Ignatius turned pale. Marina was at home, but the red ribbon was missing from her bundle. Galbert ran first. He had to make his way through the bushes. He stumbled, but kept running, because he knew that if they found something terrible, the story would turn bloody, and then no copies would help. Hedgehog and several young guys followed him. They reached the house before the older ones, and saw that the door was unlocked. Inside, it was empty. There was a parchment on the table. On the shelf was a bunch of old keys. In the corner was a bag with scraps of binding leather. The parchment said that the real trouble was not in the books, but in the people who wanted to feed their fear. At the bottom was a note in a hand that Hedgehog recognized. It was the handwriting of the old archivist of the castle, who had died many years ago. He was Hedgehog's grandfather. This was the hidden connection. The stableman turned out to be related to the archivist, and therefore to the archives and the memory of the house. Hedgehog never boasted about it, because he considered his family a disgrace. His mother worked as a laundress, and his grandfather died poor. But now this knowledge was useful. Hedgehog opened the chest and took out a narrow notebook on wax tablets. One of them was filled with a stylized image of that very bird. Underneath it was a list of taxes with a note that extraordinary levies for the wedding night had been declared illegal by the court under his great-grandfather. There was a date written in full, the year when there was a great drought and much misery in their region. The entry looked like an economic list, not a prohibition on the body. The hedgehog showed it to Galbert. He understood that this was what was missing. While they were sorting through the boards, Pontius approached the hut with two men. He tried to take the notebook. He said that young people should not meddle in the affairs of their elders. He said that threats would not heal the world. He said this wearily, like a man who had already lost. Hedgehog hid the notebook under his arm and left. He walked silently, but strode as if he were sure that no one would stop him. And indeed, no one did. Thus, the underappreciated hero finally ceased to be a frail shadow in the stable. By evening, the council and townspeople had gathered at the castle. The widow placed the box on the table. Halbert carefully laid the boards next to it. The hedgehog placed the bunch of keys so that everyone could see the old house mark. The Lord sat down and was silent for a long time. Then he said that he had heard this rumor all his life and had always feared what people in distant cities would say if he denied it. He said that true power was not to hold fear in your fist, but to let it dissolve. He said this without pretense. Pontius lowered his eyes. He understood that defeat would not kill his craft if he acknowledged the obvious. Ignatius asked permission to say a few words. He said he had received a box with a threat and a knife. He said it was not done on the master's orders, but on the initiative of those who like to spread fear, in order to gather more gifts for themselves. He said that the wheel tracks led from the hedgehog's house to the cottage, which meant that someone was trying to pit people against each other. He said that the messenger could be found by the smell of oil in the rope. He said this dryly, in a neighborly manner, and people nodded. At night, as it turns out, they will find a young collector, with a rope from the same bundle lying in his cart. The gentleman announced that no one should talk about the rite of the first night as a custom of his house anymore. He said that tomorrow everyone could come and look at the tablets and copies. He said he would write it into the statutes with precise wording about the marriage payment as an economic payment. He said that the collector who had frightened people with a box containing a knife would be punished. He said that Pontius would rewrite the statutes carefully and without ambiguity. Pontius nodded. He was already thinking about how to write as clearly as possible, so that in the future, no one would want to play on other people's fears again. The crowd began to disperse. Marina hugged her father. She thought her life had just been spared from disaster. She was wrong and right at the same time, because this was the end of the first part and the beginning of the second, where the myth would be unraveled. The next morning, the monastery courtyard resembled a workshop. On the tables lay small boards, copies of charters, and the castle book, with one corner missing, but now it no longer seemed like a terrible secret. People took turns coming up to look. The monks kept order. Halbert walked between the tables like a craftsman at a fair, pointing out where one word in a Latin line changed everything. He said that the word had to be read in context. He said that the word merchet was the payment for the right of a daughter to marry and no longer work on the estate. He said that next to it were words denoting a cow, a sack of grain, chickens, and a term. He said that there were no words about a bed there. The widow stood nearby and made a mental note of which neighbors she should take a copy of the text to, so that every household would have an understanding of the situation rather than just rumors. The hedgehog silently guarded the notebook. He remembered his grandfather telling him that any records only live when they are read together with people. He did not like phrases about the greatness of the house. He loved the order of the folds on the parchment. He gave Galbert his old knife so that he could trim the edges of the copies evenly. The gentleman approached. He asked to see the three main pieces of evidence that people usually brandish when they say that the rite of the first night was real and crude. He said he wanted to hear an explanation in simple terms. He said he was ready to write it into the statutes so that children would not argue in the same way. The first piece of evidence looked like a mention of a tax, with a name that the village pronounced as a scary word. People said that if there was a word, then there was a thing. Galbert showed that in various records, this word appeared alongside numbers, sacks, and deadlines. He said that in one place, there was even a note that if a family was poor, they could pay in installments, and sometimes they could work off their debt in the summer in the Lord's fields. He said that the meaning of this term was economic, not carnal. He said that in one leaflet found in a chest, there was a warning against elders who tried to take an extra goose or a night's lodging in a hut from young people on the night after their wedding, and that this attempt was called abuse and punished. He explained that it was precisely such stories that turned into rumors when people ceased to distinguish between the elder and the master. He said that the evidence was the same as if someone saw the word wheat harvest and decided that it was an order to steal bread from the bride. After that, many nodded. It was as if they were untangling a tight knot in their heads. The second piece of evidence was related to the records in the Chronicle that Pontius had brought from a distant city. There, as he said, was a story about the rite of the first night among the northern tribes, and it seemed to have migrated to their lands. The widow and Halbert looked at the text together. They saw that it was not their land and not their time. It described a custom that the author had heard about from merchants, and he himself had doubts because he pointed out inaccuracies. There were many explanations along the lines of people loving fear and merchants loving stories that sell. Halbert said it was like believing a merchant at a fair today who shouts that his onions cure all diseases. Next to it in the Chronicle was an entry where a priest condemned carnal sins in general. The compilers made a label out of this and hung it on the statutes. Galbert said that the evidence was weak because it was not about their place, their law, or their home, but about the conversations of distant people. He suggested writing an explanation to this effect so that future readers would immediately see where the transfer of meaning came from. The third piece of evidence was a habit. People said that since some royal decrees contained words prohibiting abuse on the wedding night, it meant that the right to the body had existed in the past. Yež carefully placed the tablet with his great-grandfather's court ruling. It said that elders and minor servants were forbidden to take any property from young people and force them to spend the night at their homes, and that fines were imposed for this. There was no mention of the right to the body. Pontius blushed because he realized that he himself had once swallowed this transfer of meaning and passed it on. Galbert explained how this happens. People take a strict formulation, write a folk word next to it, then the first disappears and the second remains. 2 generations later, this becomes the truth. He suggested punishing not the people, but the habit of reading without looking. The gentleman agreed that describing abuses was not an acknowledgement of rights, but rather a refutation of them. He said he would write it down so that future readers could see where the prohibition was and where the fiction was. After analyzing the 3 pieces of evidence, there was silence. It was not dead silence. People were thinking and comparing it to how they grew up. The widow said that the myth is based on 3 things: ignorance of letters, pride that does not like to admit mistakes, and the benefit of those who know how to scare people. She said that her husband died on the road because he believed the rumors about a safe path and did not check the document. She said that since then she has loved to see things with her own eyes rather than through hearsay. She became that very unexpected benefactor because she did not care who got the glory. She only wanted peace and quiet in her home. Pontius asked to speak. He said that distant schools teach words, but teach little about conscience. He said that he would now rewrite the statutes so that any neighbor at the well could understand their meaning without asking him. He apologized to those whom he had offended with his pride. He said that he saw Galbert as a master and that he was ready to give him a place in the office. The crowd was surprised. It was a continuation of the reversal of hidden talent against status. Skill became higher than rank. Ignatius smiled. He realized that his daughter was growing up in a place where words could heal. The hedgehog stood motionless, as always. But someone finally said aloud that nothing would have worked without him. It was old Clopas. He said that he had always underestimated the silent one, but it turned out that it was he who had brought meaning out of the dust. It was the reversal of an underestimated hero. People nodded. The hedgehog felt awkward, but he didn't run away like he used to when he was praised. He stayed with the boards and keys. He remembered that his silence had become useful. In the evening, something else important happened. A man from a neighboring village came and brought a letter from their village head. It said that they had also heard the rumor and that they had driven the young scribe away, calling him a liar, and then found out that he was right. They asked for copies of the pages that were in the widow's possession. They asked in simple words. The gentleman said he would give them copies free of charge. He said he wanted his neighbors to be at peace. He said this without calculation. Perhaps this was his true strength. Then came the moment that made all the long talk worthwhile. Everyone involved in the miller's son's wedding was gathered in the chapel. The gentleman stood up and said that on this day the younger ones would sleep in their own homes, would not be obliged to let anyone into their beds, and that anyone who demanded otherwise would be breaking the law and would be punished. He said that the payment for marriage would remain, but that it would be understandable: grain, poultry, or part of the work in the fields, because the house was losing hands. He said that the elders were obliged to explain this to the younger ones. He said that a clear line would be added to the statutes, and next to it would be indicated which fabrications were prohibited. The crowd breathed a sigh of relief. It was that very catharsis when justice does not come from above, like a random gift, but grows out of the choices of the people. Galbert chose to read. The widow chose to invest. Yes chose to retrieve memories. The gentleman chose to acknowledge. Pontius chose to rewrite. And Ignatius chose to talk about fears. All these small choices added up to great clarity. That night, Marina put on a red belt and walked quietly across the courtyard. She looked at the moon and thought that fear was like a heavy stone standing at the door. This stone was removed by everyone's hands. Below, at the gate, the hedgehog sat and looked at the stars. He held a bunch of keys nearby, like a dog holds its favorite stick. He did not think about fame. He thought about how tomorrow he would have to help Galbert mark the fields on new sheets of paper. He realized that perhaps for the first time in many years, he did not need to hide in the stable. A day later, a scroll was posted in the city. It said that the myth of the right of the first night in their house had no force and had never had it within the framework of the law, that local payments of a matrimonial nature related to the household, not to the bed, that any fees charged by the elders for overnight stays were illegal, that in the event of rumors, anyone had the right to come to the monks and obtain a copy of the line where this was recorded. There were also 3 pieces of evidence that we had already heard, set out in simple terms. First, the word about marriage in the list of taxes means payment for the departure of a female worker from the house. It is listed next to a sack of grain and a chicken, not next to a description of a bed. It follows that this is an economic measure, not a bedtime right. This is confirmed by copies with the same handwriting and notes about installment payments. And this explains why someone turned an economic term into a horror story. It's easier to shake off the excess from above. Second, chroniclers' stories about foreign lands and distant tribes are not local law. Bringing them into our home is a mistake. Even the authors themselves had doubts, pointing out that they were quoting merchants. It follows that referring to them as evidence is like treating a serious illness with the advice of a market trader. Third, royal decrees and court decisions prohibiting the abuse of elders and servants on the wedding night do not recognize the right to the body, but prohibit extortion and threats. The prohibition of abuse does not imply the existence of a right. It follows that the correct interpretation of these lines is to see in them the protection of young people, and not the abolition of a harsh custom that was not part of the laws of our house. The scroll was hung at the gate of the chapel and at the well. People approached, read it, and went about their business. They said that things had become easier. They stopped whispering so loudly. They began to argue about the price of salt. The world returned to its old ways, where the main quarrels were about whose cow had gored whose garden. Ignatius, returning from the monastery, met Pontius on the bridge. Pontius was carrying clean sheets of paper under his arm. He said he wanted to rewrite some pages in the castle book and remove ambiguous passages. He said this without any grand words. He looked tired but calm. Ignatius nodded. He remembered the knife from the box and thought that knives come in different kinds. One cuts the ropes of fear and the other cuts bread. A week later, people arrived from neighboring places, and the widow handed out copies to them. She asked only one thing, that everyone who took one read it aloud at their chapel. She said she didn't want silent shelves. They asked her to stay and live with them, but she replied that the road was calling her. She drove on. In her cart, next to the sacks, lay the very box with the bird. She cherished it, as one cherishes a fine instrument. Galbert sat down at the table and began to explain to the 2 teenagers how to read the old letters. He showed them that meaning was hidden in the narrow lines, and that a ruler was needed not only to draw straight lines, but also to indicate the boundaries of meaning. He said that literacy was not a decoration, but a way of not giving in to the fear of others. Hedgehog returned to the horses. He cleaned their manes deftly and unhurriedly. He did not like crowds. He liked work where the results were visible: a clean horseshoe, a neatly closed door, a bunch of keys on a hook. But now, when a child asked what those keys were, he could calmly say that they were the memory of home, and that memory had weight, no less than iron. The master walked across the courtyard and looked at the people. He realized that his power had not weakened from clarity, but had become more even. He was no longer afraid of someone's cry from a distant city. He understood that his name would not become accustomed to gossip if he spoke clearly. He told the steward that any new record of customs should be understandable not only to Pontius, but also to the woman at the well. The steward nodded. He thought about how much work there was to do, but shrugged. Better to work than to put out the fire of rumors. And they didn't forget about the box with the knife either. They found the collector and punished him. He was forced to work at the mill for a week, then in the fields, then he paid with geese. He was reminded that threatening his young wife could cost him his job. He was lucky to have a family who pleaded for him. He was allowed to stay at the court, but was given the worst job. He did not argue. He silently carried barrels and gradually realized that life was easier when he did not scare others. He stopped delivering packages at night without orders. The wedding celebration finally took place without tension. People ate and laughed without malice. At the end, Ignatius raised his mug and said he wanted to thank everyone who had chosen clarity over shame during those days. He said that every legend must have a boundary, and that now they had a boundary that was clearly written. He said that his daughter would live without that stone at the door. He was met with applause. He didn't like being the center of attention, but this time it was right. When silence returned to the house, Halbert sat down by the window and laid out the 3 main sheets in front of him. He read every line again. He made sure he hadn't missed any small signs. He felt tired. He thought about how sometimes the truth doesn't require big battles. It requires many small deeds. He decided that in the morning he would start teaching another student. He wanted there to be many of them, so that the myths would tire. At the end of this story, it is useful to summarize everything we have learned. The legend of the rite of the first night was based on a confusing mixture of fear, profitable retellings, and reading without context. The actual document said something else, about the economic payment for a daughter leaving home, about the prohibition of abuse of minor servants, about the fact that whispers like to cling to loud words. The 3 so-called pieces of evidence turned out to be empty if read accurately. The first, a term in the tax book, was about grain and labor, not beds. The second, stories from distant chroniclers, was about foreign lands and the author's own doubts, not local law. The third, royal prohibitions, was about punishment for extortion and threats, not recognition of rights. In each of these cases, the unexpected twists and turns of our history did not come out of the blue. They were foreshadowed by details: a bird's mark, a piece of binding, a scribe's ruler, a bunch of keys, clay on the wheels, Pontius's weary conscience, the silent precision of the hedgehog, the widow's determination, Ignatius's attention to clues. Therefore, the final justice did not happen as a miracle, but as a conclusion. There were no twists out of nowhere. There were people who noticed the little things and took steps. Looking at the bigger picture, the myth has survived for centuries, not because it is stronger than the truth. It has survived because it is often easier for people to cling to a frightening and simple explanation than to read a subtle line where a chicken, grain, and a word taken out of context stand side by side. Conversations at the well live long, but books only live if they are read. That is why this city decided that now everyone would have the opportunity to come and look at the text. They understood that transparency is also a custom, and in this same transparency, a new hierarchy was born. Where titles were once considered important, skill was now valued. Where silence was once considered empty, it was now seen as a source of support. Where strangers were once called superfluous, they were now helped to carry copies. And if a box with a rope and a knife ever appears again, people will first go to the table with the boards and only then to the gate. Not because they have become smarter, but because they have walked this path once and remembered how to stand firmly on their feet. The story ended without moralizing, but with a clear denouement. Justice came as a result of consistent choices. The myth that everyone had confused was unraveled. And now a scroll hung at the castle, a copy lay by the well, and in their heads there was no fear, but a calm thought. Before getting scared, it is worth looking at what is actually written, and if necessary, gather again and read it together. This is the right of adults to their first night without lies.